It was back in the early 90s. I worked at Paramount Pictures and we had a SQL server with redundant hard drives. Now, that part is great. What we didn't realize, however, was that one of those hard drives had failed and we didn't notice that it had failed for like 4 months. So we were able to get there in time before the other drive failed. But it would have been much better if we'd been paying attention to the logs and alerts regarding that failure. Well, in vSphere, we also have some amazing alarms that we can use to identify things that are going on. Now, we've already seen lots of these alarms inside of vSphere. When we did the high availability and we powered off one of the ESXi hosts, we had alarms popping up. When we enabled fault tolerance and we tested that fault tolerance, we had alarms coming up. And there is a boatload of alarms, and they're defined by default at the vCenter server itself, at that level. And then those alarms trickle down and they apply to the objects in the inventory of the vCenter server, which would include data centers, and clusters, and VMs, and data stores, etc. And if those alarms aren't exactly like we want them, we can customize those, or we can create our own custom alarms. And there's two basic categories regarding alarms that we can set. One is looking for some type of a condition, and when looking for a condition, it's generally based on some type of a threshold and a duration. For example, we could say if a virtual machine goes above 80% CPU utilization for 5 minutes, we'd like to be notified. Another general category for alarms are events. For example, if we have a VM and it powers off and we want to know about that, we can have an alarm based on the event of a VM powering off, or a VM being put in suspended state, or a VM being created. Those are all events, and we could go ahead and have alarms for those as well. So whether we're working with the default alarms or we're customizing alarms, we have triggers that set off the alarms based on a condition being matched or an event happening, and then as a result, we can see that alarm. For example, the little yellow triangle or the red diamond in the graphical user interface in the vSphere web client, and we can also set actions as part of those alarms to do something. For example, if we've configured vCenter to use an email server, one of the actions could be send an email message. We could send a message via Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP, and there's lots of other actions we could take as well. For example, we could have an action of suspend a VM or shut down a VM. And the list goes on and on regarding the actions that we could take once a trigger has been met. So to reinforce the concept of seeing and working with alarms and customizing alarms, let me walk you through in the hands-on lab a few scenarios that you can do as well in the hands-on lab that will help us see the cause and effect of alarms in vSphere. Here in the vSphere web client, let's take a look at some of the default alarms that are in place, and then we'll create some custom ones. So in the navigator panel here, let's go ahead and click on vCenter. And here with vCenter selected, if we click on Monitor, and then from the sub-tab, click on Issues, we then have an option right here for Alarm Definitions. So we have 192 alarms that are currently defined, and those apply to the relevant objects that are in the vCenter inventory. It's a trickle-down approach with alarms. So if we take one as an example, this VM Mac conflict alarm, if we click on that right here, over on the right, it shows us the details regarding that alarm. We can also expand the triggers and the actions, if any, that are associated with that alarm. So the triggers are a MAC address conflict, and the action is to send a notification trap, which is an action related to Simple Network Management Protocol. If we wanted to edit that, it's really easy right here. We simply click on the Edit button. So based on this alarm, it's looking for a specific event. If we click on the Next button, it'll show us what that event is. So it's looking for any of the following: a VM MAC conflict or a VM static MAC conflict. Also down here, there could be further conditions regarding that conflict, but because there's no conditions, this would apply to any VM that's inside of the vCenter inventory. And then if we click on Next or click on Actions, here it's specifying what's going to happen as a result. So if we wanted to modify the action, we could. And if we chose the option to send a notification email, we'd also want to make sure that we'd configured vCenter with an SMTP server so it could send outbound email. Alright, so I'm going to click on Cancel. I'm not going to change that default alarm. And what I'd like to do is let's go ahead down to VM3 and let's take a look at the alarms that are applicable to VM3. So we can do that with VM3 selected by clicking on Monitor and then clicking on the sub-tab of Issues. And then under Issues, we have All Issues, Triggered Alarms, which at the moment there aren't any, and Alarm Definitions. So this VM inherited effectively 16 alarms that were all defined up at the vCenter server, including that one right there. There's the VM MAC conflict alarm that we saw up here at vCenter. If we wanted to create a custom alarm right here at VM3, we could do so by simply going to Monitor, Issues, Alarm Definitions, and then clicking on the plus symbol. That would do it. Or we could right-click on VM3, and from the task menus, there's an option for alarms as well. So if we right-click on VM3 and hover over alarms in the menu, here we have an option for New Alarm Definition. Both roads lead to the same destination. So let's name this underscore Custom Alarm Busy CPU. And for the lab, I'm just going to put the underscore there. That way, if we sort alphabetically by the alarm name, it'll be very easy to find at the top or the bottom, depending on how we sort, ascending or descending. And then we could put a description of what this alarm does. And then we have the option of saying we're looking for a specific condition. And then we could use one of the radio buttons depending on what we're looking for. A specific condition or a specific event. We're going to go for the condition, looking for a busy CPU. There's a check in the checkbox for enable this alarm. That's handy. That way, if we needed to create a custom alarm and then enable it or disable it, we could do so with that checkbox right there. So let's click on next. Now it's asking what's going to trigger this alarm. So we'll click on the plus symbol. And there's lots and lots of choices that we could choose from here for a trigger. We want to use for this alarm VM CPU usage. So we'll select that. And then we have the operator here. And we're looking for is above. And then we can specify the percentage. So from the drop down here, we can specify the percentage. Let's say 80%. And let's go ahead and specify 1 minute. So what that means, if we enable this alarm for this VM, that if the CPU hits 80% for at least 1 minute, this alarm is going to fire, and it's going to go with a little warning message, the yellow triangle. We also have an option for getting an alarm with the red diamond, which is a critical condition. So if we want to use the drop down for that, we can specify what we want the CPU to be to trigger that. Let's say it's 90% for that, and 90% for 2 minutes. So regarding this alarm, let's say this point in time, let's say it's point A, let's say the CPU goes to 99%. Well, the clock's ticking, and after 1 minute, we're going to have the warning condition alarm after 60 seconds. And as it continues for another 60 seconds, which is now a total of 2 minutes, when we get to point B, it's going to turn into a critical condition. Now, if it was between 80 and 89 and never got to 90 for 2 minutes, we would never get the red diamond warning. We could have multiple triggers just by adding more with the plus symbol here, and then we can specify any or all. So if we have multiple triggers and we have the option of any one of those triggers will fire off the alarm. Or if we said all, then all of the triggers, without exception, would have to fire off before we'd get the alarm. So if we only have one condition, it doesn't matter if you say any or all because we only have one. So with that set, we'll click on next. Now it's asking about the action. Now, there already is going to be some kind of a response because we're going to get those messages. If we have high CPU utilization for 60 seconds, over 80%, it's going to go to the warning. And if the CPU is over 90% for 2 minutes, it's going to go from warning to critical. So to specify an action, we simply use the plus symbol, and then from the drop down, specify the action that we want to take. And we can scroll up and down, and there's dozens and dozens of actions. So for now, what I like to do is let's not specify an action. I just want to see the alarms. So I'm going to go ahead and with email highlighted here, I'm going to click on X to remove that, click on yes to confirm, and then we'll click on finish. So now if we sorted these alarms at the VM, and let's go ahead and click on the name column. So there's our custom alarm busy because we put the underscore there. And in this output, the C would have also been top of the list alphabetically. In any event, if we click on that to highlight it, and then we expand the triggers, it'll show us the triggers. It also identifies that this alarm was configured directly on this object, referring to VM3. So let's go ahead and start this virtual machine. We'll hit the power on icon to start the virtual machine. And I'm also going to take the browser out of full screen mode so we can open up a tab over there. And we'll give that a few seconds to initialize. And let's open up a console using the icon for console. And here's our beautiful virtual machine. So if we click on the mouse icon in the upper left-hand corner of the desktop, and then from the drop-down, click on Terminal Emulator. We'll go ahead and launch that. And then from the terminal window, let's do a GLX, G-E-A-R-S, GLX gears and press Enter. And that will absolutely get some CPU moving on this device. While that's running, let's go back to the vSphere web client. And just for a moment, with this VM still selected, let's click on Monitor, And then from the sub-tab, we'll click on Performance. And then from here, let's go ahead and for the time range, let's use the drop down and say Real Time. And then we'll go ahead and click inside of this graph to have the data come in. So the CPU utilization for this VM is going to be shown right here. And it's pretty much going to be pegged the entire time that GLX Gears is running. So under Monitor, if we go back to Issues and down to Triggered Alarms, we'll be able to see the triggered alarms here with a refresh. We'll also be able to see the icon change over here on the left in the navigator pane for VM3. And it should take less than 60 seconds. And if we want to, we can refresh periodically just to make sure we don't miss it. And there it is over here on the left. So if we click on refresh, it's showing us here the triggered alarm. Also over here on the right, if we click on the alarms, there's our custom alarm busy CPU. We can click on that. And that brings up some additional details about that alarm. So we'll go ahead and let's minimize the alarms over on the right and click on refresh because it's going to be less than 60 seconds before that puppy goes to critical. Because if we go back to performance for that VM, it is still pegged at 100%. So we'll go back to Issues, Triggered Alarms, click on Refresh. And if you don't use refresh here, it should show up here on the left first like it just did. There we go. There's our critical alert. And then if we click on Refresh, we can see it here in the triggered alarms as well. Great, so it's functional. Let's go back to the virtual machine. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the GLX Gears. And then go back to the vSphere web client. And so with this alarm, we could right click on it and then acknowledge it. Now acknowledge it doesn't make it go away, but it does let other people on your team, for example, know it's been acknowledged. Or we could click on reset to green, which does make it go away. The other thing we could do is neither of those things. And as the CPU goes down below 90% for that 2 minutes, and as it goes down below 80% for that minute, this alarm result of critical will actually go away. So over here on the left, you can see it already has. And if we click on refresh here, that triggered alarm no longer shows up. However, for this VM, if we went to tasks and events, it's still going to be recorded as an event. So if we click on events and click on a refresh to make sure we're looking at the latest and greatest, we still have information regarding that alarm triggering. So if we bring this up just a little bit so we can read below, this is when it went from green to yellow, and the next one was when it went from yellow to red. Alright, so let's kick this up a notch and let's create an action associated with the alarm going off. So to do that, let's go back to Monitor and Issues for this VM. And under Alarm Definitions, let's go ahead and click on our custom alarm that we just created. Click on Edit, and we'll do some tweaking. So if we go to Triggers, we still have the same triggers. 80% for 1 minute goes to warning. 90% for 2 minutes goes to critical. So if we click on Actions, and we click on the plus symbol, we can add an action. So from the drop down, let's click on Suspend VM. Now by default, it's showing that once we go from yellow to red, it's going to do that Suspend VM one time. Or if we wanted to, we could go ahead and apply that action when it goes from its normal state to a warning. So what I propose we do is this. For the suspend action, let's go ahead and do it here on from warning going to critical. So from the drop down, we have options of nothing, or once, or repeat regarding the action. So let's select once and click on Finish. And let's go back to VM3. We'll hit the up arrow key to run GLX Gears again, and then go back to the vSphere web client. And it's just going to be a matter of time before it goes to the warning status and then the critical status. And once it goes critical, it's going to suspend the machine. So while we're waiting for that, under the Monitor tab for that VM, if we go to Performance, and with Overview selected, we still have the real-time graph, and we can also verify that CPU once again has gone up to 100% with that GLX Gears application running on that VM. So if we go back to Issues under the Monitor tab for that VM, and we click on Triggered Alarms, once the alarm comes in on that VM, if we have a refresh here, we'll also be able to see that alarm right here. So over on the left, I noticed it just changed to the warning, so we'll click on Refresh, and it should show up here as well. That's fantastic. And the critical condition message will be less than 60 seconds. And with editing, I may slice some of that out as well. But when you do this lab, it should be a full 60 seconds. So over here on the left in the navigator pane, if we keep our eye over here, when it changes to the red diamond, we should see that here first. And then we can click on Refresh to see it here in the Triggered Alarm section. We can also click over here to see the alarms as well. Well, and there it is. It just changed. So it just changed over here on the left. It also just changed here as well. And if we click on Refresh, we can see the alarm in the Triggered Alarm section as well. And based on that alarm, what's happening in the background, that alarm should be taking the action of suspending that virtual machine. So if we go to recent tasks, that's exactly what's happening right here. So in a few moments, that machine is going to be suspended. And it says it's done. So if we minimize the recent tasks, over here on the left, we have a little icon on the VM representing it's been suspended. And on the VM under Monitor for tasks and events, if we go there and click on refresh, we can see the event of the virtual machine being suspended right here. So with this VM, we have a couple of choices. Because it's suspended, we could either power it off, like yanking the power, or we could resume it. So if we right click and go to power and go to power on, that will resume the VM. So with that resumed, let's open up a new console for that VM. And there we go. And the GLX gears are still cranking away. So I'm going to go ahead and stop GLX gears. And let's go back to the vSphere web client. And I'm going to power off VM3 by simply clicking on the shutdown icon. And then clicking yes to confirm. So that's an example that we just did of creating a custom alarm based on a condition, looking at the CPU utilization for a period of time on a VM. We can also look for a specific event that's happening. So for example, here at cluster 2, if we wanted an alarm to go off, if we had some event happen inside of our cluster, we could set the alarm at this level and it would trickle down and apply to the relevant objects in the vCenter inventory that are within cluster 2. So for example, a host losing connectivity to a data store, or a host being put into maintenance mode, or a VM that's changing state, including a VM that just was suspended. That's an event. So if we wanted to create a custom alarm at the cluster 2 level, what we could do is simply right click on cluster 2. And from here, hover over alarms and then create a new alarm definition at the cluster level. We could also go to the monitor tab and work our way down to viewing and editing and creating alarms there as well, very similar to what we did on the VM. So here at the cluster level, let's name this underscore looking for suspend events for VMs. And again, the underscore will just help us in the lab to be able to easily find it. And then regarding monitoring for, let's specify that we're monitoring for a specific event regarding a virtual machine. So with those selected, we'll click on next. Now the trigger is going to be a VM that's currently been put in the standby state. So to select that trigger, we'll click on the plus symbol, and from the drop down, we'll go ahead and find VM suspended, which is right here. So we'll click on VM suspended, and then furthermore, we could add a condition so we could be very granular. For example, we'll click on the plus symbol regarding a further condition, and for the drop down, with an operator of equal to, and then we'll simply type in VM-3. If we left off the name, it would apply to any VM in that cluster that was put in suspend mode. So now here for the actions, we can specify what we want to have happen as an action in addition to getting the alert. So if all we want is the alert, we don't need any additional actions. We don't have to put anything here as far as additional actions, and we can simply click on finish. And then at the cluster, if we click on monitor, and then we click on the sub-tab for issues, and then we click on the option for alarm definitions, it's going to show us all the alarm definitions that are applicable to this cluster, including the one that we just created. And so if we click in the name column, and then we scroll up in the name column, the very first one is going to be the one we created because we have the underscore. So with that selected, if we want to see the details for that, it's over here on the right. We can expand it. And here it confirms what we just configured. So we're going to have a little domino effect. If we bring up VM3 and we launch the GLX gears after 2 minutes, it's going to suspend, and that suspend state is going to trigger the custom alarm that we just created at the cluster. So let's do it. Let's right click on VM-3, hover on power, and click power on. Let's go ahead and close our old tab for VM3. We'll give that a moment to initialize, and then we'll right click on VM3. And from the menu for VM3, we'll simply click on Open Console, which will open up a new tab for VM3. And then at the desktop for VM3, we'll click on the mouse in the upper left-hand corner, click on the terminal emulator to open that up, and then type in GLX gears as a way to generate a whole bunch of CPU usage on this virtual machine. And then let's go back to the vSphere web client. So in 60 seconds, it should go to yellow, and then another 60 seconds, it should go to red, which will trigger the suspend, which will trigger the event that there was a VM named VM-3 that was suspended. So if we click on VM3 in the navigator pane, and we go to the monitor tab, and we go to performance, and let's specify from the drop down for time range that we want to look at real time, it's showing us once again that the CPU is pegging at 100% from a VM perspective which means those alarms should trigger very, very soon. So if we click over here on alarms, and I'm going to click on the pin here to go ahead and pin this in the interface. And as the alarms come in, we'll be able to easily see all of them right here. Okay, so there's our warning regarding CPU busy. And shortly on its heels, we're going to have the red diamond for the critical, based on CPU being over 90% for 2 minutes. And there we have it. And then followed shortly thereafter by the alarm that's indicating that we had a VM named VM-3 that has been put into suspend mode. So now, my friend, it is your turn. Have some fun in the hands-on lab practicing with alarms inside of vSphere, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.